Back when I was a bit younger, my beard a bit darker, my knees a bit stronger, I was one of the program directors for summer camp at Camp McDowell, which was the diocesan camp in the Diocese of Alabama. I did this for 7 summers in a row. I am a glutton for punishment. I did Midler Camp, which was for rising 5th and 6th graders. So we had a lot of 10, 11, 12-year-olds running around and me trying to keep up with them. But one of the programs I led talked about faith. Now you can instantly assume that faith had something to do with God and Jesus. And yes, as the priest in charge of a program at camp, it would stand to reason that I would include God and Jesus in what I did. And I did do that, but faith works in other ways too. What does it mean to have faith or trust or belief in something or someone? Keep that thought in mind because I'll come back to it. At camp, the staff had to have faith in one another. We had to trust one another in order for things to work and to run smoothly. And when the staff is off because that faith or that trust is lost, it hurts the outcome. As the program director for the session, I also helped check the kids in when the parents would drop them off. And looking into the parents' faces, into their eyes, it was clear that they needed to have faith in all of us. Faith and belief that we would take care of their children that they were about to leave with us for several days. Faith and trust and belief that they would be in good hands. And they were. So you could see faith beginning to grow in the staff and in the campers even before I started my program about faith. So one year my program was called Faith Against All Odds. And I talked about how people in the Bible could overcome circumstances and obstacles in their lives through their faith. We looked at people such as Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and his sons, and David. We did use the story of David and Goliath, not the story we heard this morning, so don't worry. Then we looked at Mary and Joseph, and finally at Jesus. In the gospel stories about Jesus, we hear a lot about faith, both strong faith and small faith. How some have it and how some greatly lack it. We hear stories where people would travel great distances just to see Jesus, even if they didn't know him. They only heard about him and what he could do. And we've heard some of those stories in this Pentecost season. People who left sick loved ones at home to find Jesus, risked their own health, or did many things just to catch a glimpse of him or touch the fringe of his clothing, as we heard last week in our gospel. Faith was strong in these people because it was their faith, their belief that they would find what they needed that led them to Jesus. But then there are the 12 people Jesus handpicked to be around him who didn't always have faith or trust or belief in Jesus. How many times have you heard me say that it's the people, mostly, many times unnamed, that seem to show greater faith than the disciples? The disciples have to learn how to have faith, how to trust, how to believe, and Jesus certainly helps them. So I would talk to the kids about growing in that faith. Well, today we get 2 departures in our readings, 2 stories that take us in different directions. Those whose faith grows and becomes strong, and those whose faith weakens a bit. We make a move today in our gospel reading as we depart from Mark's gospel and move over to John. And we'll be in John for the next few weeks as we hear what is known as the bread discourse. Readings that will begin to show us how Jesus is, in fact, the living bread that came down from heaven to nourish us and to feed us both physically and spiritually. That's one departure. And then we have the story of David walking apart from faith and apart from God. David, the one who had always been shown favor by God, and the one who had overcome great odds the one chosen by God as the least of his family, who defeated Goliath, who was able to raise a great army to defend Israel and become their king, only to lose focus and fall from grace. Power is shown by two men today, Jesus and David. And we see how that power is abused by the people, in Jesus' case, by the crowd, and by David himself. Our gospel reading today begins with the feeding of the 5,000, a very familiar story, I'm sure. And in fact, it's the only miracle story that appears in all four of the gospels. They all talk about this particular feeding of the 5,000. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the emphasis seems to be more about the compassion Jesus has for the people, as they seem to be like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus here becomes the shepherd. He comforts them and he feeds them. In John, however, the emphasis is more about faith, and in particular, the faith of the disciples, and how Jesus tests them and helps them to learn and grow in their faith and trust. John often has Jesus do things in front of the disciples so that they will see and believe, not always for the people, but for the disciples in particular. So we have a very pastoral scene. We're told it's spring, near the feast of the Passover, thus connecting this act of feeding the people to that of the Exodus and God feeding the Israelites with manna in the wilderness. This scene might bring to mind Psalm 23 and the great shepherd leading his people in the green pastures as Jesus has them sit down to be fed. Then Jesus, knowing what he will do, turns to Philip to test him and says, "Where can we buy bread for all these people?" And we hear Philip respond, and I'm sure many of you are thinking that Philip may have said something different than what's actually written in the text. I'm sure he did, but all we know is what was written down, and Philip says, 6 months' wages. Jesus, 6 months' wages would not buy enough food, even for everyone to have just a little bit. His answer is, as Jesus expects, his faith, their faith, is not strong enough yet. Believe that Jesus will find a way to feed all these people. And then Andrew tells Jesus there is a boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. Now I think it's important to note that John uses barley loaves. Barley would have been a grain used by the poor because wheat was too expensive. So it emphasizes Jesus' ministry to the poor. So Jesus tells the disciples to have the people sit down, and he takes the loaves, the fish, and he feeds them. We know the miracle. It happens, they're all fed to their fill. Then Jesus says, "Take up what is left," again linking it to Exodus and Moses telling the Israelites to collect the manna so that none will be lost, that none will be wasted. And they take up 12 baskets full, 12, much more than they had when they started. This shows the abundance of God's grace given to them in Jesus. This is where the people begin to turn a little bit. The people, having witnessed this miracle, having been fed, begin to talk, and they say that this is the prophet who has come into the world, and they begin to abuse the power shown to them by Jesus by wanting to take him, physically take him by force, and make him king over the people. They think that they now hold the power. So Jesus, realizing what they're about to do, withdraws to the mountain to be by himself. Jesus did not come to be an earthly king. The people have been fed. They want Jesus to be king so that he can feed them always and give them what they want. Jesus does feed us, but not always in the way we want, but in the way he knows we need. The people and the disciples do not understand this yet. Their faith is not strong enough. It's still young, and they have much to learn. Jesus teaches them, tests them, and us in order to allow our faith to grow. Jesus also shows the disciples that they will be safe if they only trust in him. And we hear of Jesus walking on the water, coming to the disciples to tell them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Don't be afraid. Have faith. Believe. Words that we've heard Jesus say so many times. But do we hear it? And are we listening? David's abuse today comes in his losing his focus and trust on God. In a weak moment, he calls for the wife of Uriah the Hittite, one of his great soldiers, and he uses or abuses his power as king to get what he wants, and then he tries to cover it up. When that doesn't work, he gives the desperate order to end Uriah's life. David falls, and the consequences of this fall we will hear next week in our reading from 2 Samuel. David takes loyalty for granted. He has been shown great loyalty by God, and he has shown until this point loyalty to God and to the people entrusted to his care. But here he takes that loyalty for granted, and he tries to get Uriah to break rank, to not be loyal. And yet it is Uriah who shows the most loyalty, and he pays for it with his life. Now I realize this is a heavy story and it ends in such a dark way, so I thought I would share another story that somewhat goes with the story to help lighten the mood. When I was in my previous parish in Florence, Alabama, had some parishioners who had been members of the church for a very, very long time, Joe and Lucy. And Lucy worked on the altar guild, and Joe had served about every position you can serve in the church. And Lucy died. And Joe wanted to do a memorial for Lucy, and he asked if he could do a stained glass window. Now, it's hard to picture in here, but in the nave there were 2 windows on either side that didn't have stained glass in them. They had what was called filler glass that had been there for 100 years, and I was told it was put in until someone wanted to put a stained glass window in. So I said, yeah, that's fine, we can do a stained glass window. I said, who would you like to use? And he said, well, I want you to figure that out. I said, okay. So I did. I got a company, and then I said to Joe, I said, well, what do you want to be in these windows? What would you like them to depict? And Joe said, well, Lucy's favorite character in the Bible is Ruth. So I'd like Ruth to be on one of the panels. So these windows had 2 different panels in them. And I said, okay, and he wanted it to say above Ruth, your people shall be my people and your God, my God. And I said, that's easy enough. And what about the other side? He said, well, my favorite story from the Bible is that of David and Absalom. And I thought, okay. Now, backstory to that, Joe and Lucy had a young child die when he was 9 years old. And so what Joe wanted in this window were the words, Absalom, would God I had, oh Absalom, my son, would God I had died for thee. And so I thought, okay, so David grieving over Absalom. So I had the artist draw all these pictures up, and I thought they looked great. And I showed them to Joe, and he said, well, Ruth is fine, but I'm not sure about David. I said, well, what's wrong with David? He said, you don't have Absalom in here. And I said, Joe, did you really want to put a picture of a dead guy hanging in a tree with arrows in his back in the window in the church that everyone sees when they first walk in? And he said, yeah, maybe you're right. Maybe that's not the best image to have when they walk in. I said, all right. So we go with David. He's got a lyre in his hand. He's kind of looking up and grieving. So the windows come in, the installer's there to put them in, and I invited Joe to come down and watch them going in. And so we're doing that, and I'm looking across the way to the window that's opposite, and I'm thinking, well, I wonder what would be nice to put in those windows right across from Ruth and David. And it's nice, you know, having Ruth and David, great-grandmother and great-grandson there. I said, maybe across from Ruth, we could put Boaz, and they could be sort of looking at each other and pining for one another. And then across from David, I don't know, maybe we'll put Bathsheba bathing. And Joe looks at me and he goes, Andy, you won't let me put a dead guy in a tree and you're going to put a naked lady on a window in the church? And I said, touche, Joe. And we didn't do it. But back to camp. I asked the question earlier, what does it mean to have faith or trust or belief in something or someone? The disciples may not have known how to answer this question. They're still growing in their faith in Jesus, but the kids I had at camp seemed to know exactly how to answer it. When I would do these programs with the kids, I would always have them act out the stories. So I'd pick kids each time I did a story, and there was a pile of costumes because it's camp. You have to have costumes everywhere at camp. And the kids would come up and throw stuff on, and they would act out the parts of the story as we read the story. And then they were also assigned a small group. So after we met each day, they would break off into their small groups to discuss what we had done and other things like that. In this particular year, I said that I would randomly pick one of the small groups to preach the sermon at the closing Eucharist that year, and I'd give them a couple days to work on it. Well, when that time came, we did the Eucharist. I wasn't sure what the group was going to do for their sermon, but what they did was amazing, especially since I had been seeing their own faith grow over the days we were together and witnessed the trust they had placed in us to care for them. So they played music, and as this music was playing, they acted out kind of a recap of the week. They started with Jesus standing there, and they had Moses and Elijah on either side. And then one by one, they had these great people of faith about whom we had talked that week walk by Jesus. So Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Mary, etc. And then at the end, in a very beautiful way, all the characters sat back down in their chairs, and Jesus sort of walked back and forth in front of them, giving them kind of an acknowledging nod as if to say, "Well done, good and faithful servants." And then they all reached out to Jesus as if to say, "It is you who brings us here. It is you who shows us that faith. It is you who allows us to do what we do." The campers gave us an example we could follow. They saw that faith and that trust and that belief. They learned it and they showed it to us. And we can learn from them. We, the adults, the ones looked at to teach and set the examples, the ones trusted to be the leaders and the helpers. Sometimes it is good for us to see Christ through their eyes, the eyes of the children, for they have a lot to teach us, and we still have a lot to learn.